So raise your hand high if you drove by an airport this morning. Lots of us, right? We live close to an airport here in Austin, so many of us pass by that airport, and those of us who didn't pass by it this morning, I bet we've been by it before, haven't we? Now, have you ever noticed something about airports? The runways on airports are smooth, they're flat. Have you ever noticed that? Why is it the case that at this airport, at the Austin Berkshire International Airport, why is it not the case that the runway is bumpy like this? Could you imagine trying to land on a bumpy runway? Ooh. Why is it flat? Why, for instance, don't we make runways so that they're going up a mountain? Wouldn't that make sense, right? Have the plane go up the mountain, and then it'll just go into the air. Doesn't that make sense? And then when they come down from the mountain, then when they come down from the sky, they should just come down the side of the mountain. Doesn't that make sense? You're shaking your head. No. For some reason, runways are flat, and runways are smooth, right? And that's how we should be making our lives during these days of Advent. Think about it for a moment. In today's first reading, the prophet Baruch is telling us that the Messiah is going to come, and all people are going to come together in Jerusalem. Again, we're going to come back from our captivity back to Jerusalem together. And instead of having to take all sorts of winding roads, we're going straight back to Jerusalem. Follow me? Have any of you ever gone up mountains before? Have you driven up a mountain before? This July, we were at Mount Haleakala in Hawaii. And on the GPS, it looked like we weren't that far from the top of the mountain. Here we were at the bottom of the mountain, and here was the top of the mountain. On the GPS, it looked close. But you know how it was, right? We looked close, but we were going up this side of the mountain, and then crossing back and coming down the other side of the mountain, and going up, and going up, and going up, until we finally got to the top. We didn't go straight up the mountain, follow me? Could you imagine driving your car straight up the mountain? We have to keep going back, and then back the other way, and back a little higher, until eventually we get to the top of the mountain. It's not a straight path to the top of the mountain. Baruch said, when God gathers together all of God's people, they're going straight to Jerusalem. There are no switchbacks on the road to Jerusalem. There's no turning back one way and turning back the other. We're all going straight back to Jerusalem. And when the Messiah comes, says St. John the Baptist in today's Gospel, he's not going to be wandering all around here and there. No, when the Messiah comes back, he's coming straight back. Like those planes that are coming in for a landing, we're preparing a smooth, straight runway so they can fly right on in. Brothers and sisters, how is that runway in your heart? Is it smooth and flat so that God can easily come into it? So that others can easily come into our hearts? Or are our hearts a bit more bumpy? I love the image that we have in both the first reading and the Gospel, because it talks about valleys and mountains. Did you hear that? Instead of us having to go down into the valleys or go up on the mountains, it talks about going straight. How many of us in our hearts have valleys of sadness and depression and loneliness and sickness during these days before Christmas? Is there any way for us to lift ourselves and or others up when they're in those valleys? Can you think of anyone, a family member, a friend who's going through the dark valley today who you could reach out to by phone or with a visit or a kind word? Anyone passing through the valley today? What about those people who have mountains of pride and arrogance in their hearts? It's hard to go straight into someone's heart when their heart is filled with pride and arrogance. You follow me? Maybe Advent's also a good time for us to look into our hearts and see how smooth is the runway. Are we able to fill up those valleys, level down those mountains, so that God can come into our hearts, and so that we can in turn go out to the hearts of others? It seems that that's the challenge. In today's second reading, St. Paul is writing to a colony of military veterans in Philippi. Military veterans. These are people who are military people who saw some pretty rough things and whose hearts, in some ways, had grown a bit cold. You know what I mean? And St. Paul is writing them saying, I am praying that God will continue to do the good work in you that God has begun, that you might grow in love more and more and more. That's my prayer for you. Brothers and sisters, my prayer for all of us during these days before Christmas is that God might continue the work that God has begun in us, that we might grow in love more and more and more, so that we might be able to help reach out and lift up those who are going through the dark valleys this Advent, so that we might reach out in love to those whose hearts are filled with arrogance and pride, and that all of us together might help to make a straight, smooth runway for God to come into our hearts.